Alright then, Year 12. So the next section of the lesson, we're going to be looking at what Christians agree on with the Eucharist. So we'll be looking at some key background ideas, the biblical background, and getting to know the terminology. The main tasks we're going to do are going to be on pages 4, 5 and 6 of your workbooks. And then we're going to go back and have a look at pages 2 to 3. This whole bit here will take us about half an hour, 45 minutes. There's only going to be about 10-15 minutes of me talking and sometimes do some activities in between, and then you'll move on to the third part of this online lesson where you'll be doing an extended task on looking at what Christians disagree on. But for now, what do Christians agree on? Over these next few slides, which are going to match to pages 4, 5 and 6 in your booklets, it's your choice whether you want to read through the pages first and then listen to me explain some of the ideas, or watch this part of the video first, then read the notes. That's up to you. There's deliberately space left in the booklet around the edges of the notes so that you can add your own annotations. There's a couple of places where it might be ideal to just add a couple of extra notes. Okay, so Christians agree on the Eucharist. It's a nearly universal practice for Christians to celebrate. There's a couple of exceptions to that. Much smaller groups like the Quakers and the Salvation Army don't tend to practice it, but just about every other church will do so. They might call it by different names, so you might have heard of it called communion or the Lord's Supper, Mass, breaking of the bread. But although there's different names, there is a similarity that weekly Christians will gather together to partake in this meal. Usually Eucharist is done once a week on a Sunday in churches, might be more often in some churches, and usually once the bread is broken and blessed, anything that's left over after the service will be kept in the church for private Eucharist that might be given out during the week. We're going to be looking at different interpretations of the significance of the event, but we'll start off by looking at the agreement over why it's such an important ritual in the life of the church. When we say that it is really important, we've said before that both the Orthodox and Catholic Church have 7 sacraments, of which this is one, but other churches will see this as one of the other 2 sacraments, and the reasons for that is what's coming up next. So the main reason that it's seen as so important is that Jesus commanded it. We find this in the Bible in several places. We've got references here from Luke's Gospel and from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It does appear in 2 of the other Gospels. We'll talk through that in a little while. But what we seem to have agreement on here is that at the last meal, the Last Supper that Jesus ate with his disciples on the day before Good Friday, he took some bread, he gave thanks. It's very, very common to give a blessing over bread in the Jewish tradition, and he broke it. He gave it to them saying, "This is my body given for you. This is my body." The big question we've got is, what does that mean? But this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And that goes on to that second point of how this connects to the past. The old covenant is the old promises between the fathers of Judaism, Abraham, Moses, and others. And that deal is that God will forgive the Jews as long as each year there is a sacrifice given as part of a ritual. This happens at Yom Kippur. And at Yom Kippur we have the Day of Atonement, where a sacrifice is given for the forgiveness of sins. But significantly, this meal was almost certainly eaten around Passover. There's some dispute whether it happened the night of Passover or the night before. And at Passover, there was a remembrance of the covenant made with Moses that God would protect his people. So that was the old covenant, but this new covenant is in Jesus' blood. This ties into themes of sacrifice. Again, we'll explore that in a little more detail in a coming up slide. But what we see here is something that connects to the past, but also gives something new and unique. The old covenant involved a regular sacrifice each year. This new covenant, Jesus' blood, is poured out once and for all time. There's also agreement between all churches that this is a focus of thanksgiving. Jesus himself gives thanks for the bread and wine. We see this in all the accounts. And the word Eucharist literally translates as good gifts, or let's give thanks. Christians give thanks for their atonement and the forgiveness that God gives through atonement, through Jesus' sacrifice. We'll explore that in a bit more detail. But the important thing we have here is that there's an agreement that Jesus commanded it, that it's a ritual that connects to the past, but also looks forward to how Christianity is unique, and it's a great focus of Thanksgiving. If you now turn to page 5 in your booklet, we're going to just have a look at some scholarship in this area. Now, this is based on the extension reading that's at the back of your booklet on the Eucharist from Alistair McGrath's Christian Theology. Actually, do you know what? It's not in your booklet, but it is on Moodle on the page there, so just make sure you've got it. Now, Alistair McGrath is a Christian theologian. We'll study him next year when we're looking at religion and science. He writes in response to Richard Dawkins quite a lot. But McGrath, his focus really is Christian theology, and he does quite a lot of detailed analysis of the thoughts behind the actions we find in Christianity. Now, he says there are 4 functions for Christians. The first is recollection, looking backwards. One of the things with the Eucharist is the way it seems to have replaced the understanding of the Passover meal within Christianity. Because Jesus was crucified over the Passover, this was seen as deeply, deeply symbolic. And so in this action of taking the bread and the wine, there is an echo of looking back to the way that God chose to save people in the Old Testament, particularly in the Passover and Exodus. At the Seder meal, which is the meal that's eaten the night before Passover in the Jewish tradition, both bread and wine are eaten, the bread is broken, a blessing is said. So there's a lot of similarity to what's happened, although there is dispute over this. And if you fancy looking into it more, just Google, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? So there's a sense in which, in this action, you are looking back on the history of God in the world. There's always a sense of looking forwards, of anticipation. So for Paul, in the letter to the Corinthians we had on the previous slide, says that by participating in the Eucharist, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. This is talking about the second coming of Jesus, the time when he comes back to bring about Judgment Day. So Christians will look forward to a time when they will be with the Jesus they remember. So in this action, we are looking back and we are looking forwards. There are also present functions, and this is twofold. We often find this in Christian ritual, and to be fair, we find this in ritual in a lot of the world religions. So as well as looking back and looking forward, there is a focus on the present, on affirming the faith, both of the individual, but also of the community. So in terms of the affirmation of individual faith, by taking part in this ritual, the individual feels that they are filled with Jesus, they feel that they are filled with the Spirit, they feel deeply in touch with their own faith. And if you watch the videos where people are receiving the Eucharist, you can see just how monumental the moment is for many of them. It is a moment of quiet contemplation and thanksgiving. More than that though, the Eucharist is a communal activity, and it strengthens the faith of the community, people coming together, affirming their commitment to Jesus together. The original meaning of sacrament was a military oath. It was about a promise you made to be together as a team. And we find a similar thing in this present affirmation of communal faith. One of the interesting discussions at the minute is how Eucharist is occurring, given the social distancing we're seeing in a lot of Catholic countries. The fact that Rome has stopped communion in all churches and did that quite early on in this current crisis was really quite significant. And there was a lot of protests from ordinary Catholics objecting that how on earth could the church choose not to allow people to come together at this point when what was needed more than anything was individual and collective faith in Jesus. Okay, so having looked through those 4 different functions, there's space on page 5. Pause the video in just a moment and then scribble down some notes in those boxes to help you remember these 4 functions. You can use images, there's a couple suggested on the slide, but do something for yourself too. Just make a note in there some of the key ideas and also some of the extra detail we were just talking about there that you might use to develop or explain this. Okay, pause the video now. So, welcome back after that little work break. If you'd like to share what you've just done there, if you're particularly proud of it, just take a photo, drop me an email with it in, or post it on one of the Moodle forums. And now we're going to have a look at page 6 in your workbook, which is just looking at the biblical background. So if you did have to write an extended piece on why there were similarities and what those similarities were, you could ground this in the Bible as thoroughly as possible. So there are 4 New Testament accounts of the Last Supper. 3 of these are in the Gospel, and 1 is in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the first one. And what they all have in common is that Jesus takes the bread and wine and says that they are his body and blood. These are called the institution narratives because this is where the ritual of the Eucharist is first instituted or brought to be. Now, the 4 accounts do show some subtle differences. Just before we look at that, I'm just going to mention that the Last Supper is not mentioned in John's Gospel. Now, one of the things with John's Gospel is that it has a different chronology to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. The events of Jesus' crucifixion happen on different days, although it's in the same order. Now, the 3 Gospel accounts that include an account of Last Supper are the ones that are tying this to being the day that Passover has happened. So there is a suggestion that this is supposed to be a Passover meal. John's Gospel, instead of having the Last Supper, has the disciples going off to eat together, but then long, long speeches from Jesus explaining how the Holy Spirit is going to come. There's quite an interesting thing here, in that in all of these stories, there is a pointing ahead to the way that even after Jesus will die, which Jesus believes to know, and which the disciples believe him to know, not only is he going to die, but that he will return in some form, either through the Eucharist or through the Spirit, or through the coming of the Messiah for the second time, the Parousia. But I'm going off a little bit here, so let's focus on what these differences are. So in Luke and Paul in Corinthians, there's quite a focus on Jesus as the risen Lord. So this means it's seen as a foretaste of the future heavenly banquet, and it's celebrated in memory of him. There are only subtle hints of sacrifice imagery. Matthew and Mark, though, reflect a slightly later tradition, and they emphasise the idea of Jesus dying a sacrificial, redemptive death for all for the forgiveness of sins. And his death once and for all replaces the sacrifices of the temple sacrificial system. Now, this is hinted at in Luke and Paul, but in Matthew and Mark, there's a lot more imagery that makes us think that Jesus is the new sacrificial lamb. In your booklet and on the slide here, we've got an extract from the letter to the Hebrews. Now, that's significant because obviously they're going to be richly, richly steeped in Jewish tradition. And what this passage from the Hebrews says, if you just want to have a look over it. So it makes the point that the Jewish sacrifices of the Old Covenant are repeatedly, endlessly, year after year. And that shows that they can't be a perfect sacrifice, because if it was a perfect sacrifice, you wouldn't have to keep doing it every single year. However, when Jesus comes into the world, he says a body's been prepared and that will be sacrificed. And that this sacrifice is offered in accordance with the law, but will fulfill the law, because this sacrifice is done once and for all. And it's interesting that early on in Christianity, temple sacrifice was stopped very, very early. So the view that Jesus' death on the cross was a sacrifice only gradually dawned on the early Christians. Jesus himself had been really critical of the sacrifice rituals performed in the temple. So they initially thought that that meant it had been rejected. But Jesus' own words at the Last Supper, where he offers his body and blood, was taken later to mean that his death will be a sacrifice. So he himself is enacting the ritual of his death. The body and the blood are separated in the ritual, and that's a sign of death. So as time went on, there became to be more thinking around what the symbolism was here, and early Christians became more and more convinced that actually what we were seeing here was Jesus not rejecting sacrifice, but replacing it once and for all. So for the last task we're going to do in this section, I'm going to ask you to try and get your head around some of the terminology that is used to describe the Eucharist. Each one focuses on kind of a different aspect of the meaning of it, and it would be good if you could comment in your writing about some of the different understandings we have of the Eucharist here, despite the fact that these terms are used by many different Christians. So, there are many ways in which the Bible refers to this most important meal for Christians, and a quick look at these is a good introduction to some aspects of it. You'll also find in your workbook on page 3 a couple of terms that we don't find in the Bible but that have also become quite popular. There's also quite a longer Bible passage there for reference. It's also from the letter to the Corinthians. It comes just before the passage that we've read before. And what we have here is Paul telling off the Corinthians for acting out the Last Supper or the Eucharist in a sense, but really ignoring the main point of it. So just have a look at that if you want to extend. So as you can see, you've got a task here. I'm going to think this is going to take about 10-15 minutes. I'm just going to look through those different terms, read the description. There's a little question in the final column for you to have a think about. Try and add a little image if you can to try and express the key idea. And as I said, if you fancy having a go at that extension, have a look. And I'll make some space on the forum for us to feedback on that. Okay guys, so that is all the work I'm asking you to do on this section. I want you to run away and do it now. And then when you feel ready, scroll down the page on Moodle and you can start to have a look at the main task in this part of the work. Okay, take care guys.